there's a new person running for South Carolina State Superintendent of Education as a write-in candidate. In this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I speak exclusively with Dr. Michele Phillips one-on-one. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Dr. Michele Phillips.
Yes, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great, actually.
Excellent.
It's so great to meet you.
Thank you for meeting with me today.
Anytime, because obviously I'm meeting with you because you have some developing news right now.
We do. After Israel Romero decided to withdraw from the race for state superintendent, I decided to run a write-in campaign for state superintendent for South Carolina.
What is your story?
Where to begin? I am a teacher. I'm an educator, and I've been in education now for 18 years. I've taught in middle school classrooms, college classrooms. I've worked with teachers in some of our most at-risk schools. It's my passion. Teaching is my passion, learning is my passion, and making sure that each child has access to a quality education where they feel safe and valued has been one of my top priorities during my entire career. I'm a mom. I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old. I'm married. We just moved 3.5 weeks ago, so we are in like box craziness right now. But yeah, I guess that's in a nutshell my current story.
You talk about your obviously 18 years of it in the education world. What is the biggest difference between 18 years ago and right now in your mind?
Sometimes I feel like there's a huge shift in the way that we are using and sometimes maybe even relying on technology rather than thinking about getting back to good core instruction. But at the end of the day, good teaching is good teaching. Kids are kids. Right. It's been the same forever. I think what we see now is our children live in this multimedia technology-driven world, and part of our job as teachers is to help them learn how to negotiate that world, how to find good information, how to use technology responsibly and with purpose, okay. Which when I started teaching, I didn't have any extra computers in my classroom. We had like a 27-inch TV strapped to the wall in the corner. So it's a completely different world in terms of technology. But I think in terms of what good instruction is and what kids need, I don't know that it's changed that much.
That brings me to my next question. What is the state of education in South Carolina?
I guess it depends on what headline you read on what day. So South Carolina, the headline right now is we're 49th or 50th in education, and that's looking at one test. Okay. That's looking at the ACT. And to Molly Spearman's credit, she's also spoken about this issue. When you're looking at one test, you're not getting an accurate picture about what's going on in South Carolina. And one of the pluses, one of the benefits, one of the good things that we're doing is allowing each child in the state to take that test. So every child in South Carolina, every junior gets to take the ACT, with the idea that they will go on with their education. Well, when everybody's taking a test, your data is going to look different than if you only have your top 4% students taking that test. So that kind of makes South Carolina, I think, look worse than what's the reality of our classrooms. The reality is for education in South Carolina, we have some places that are doing incredible work, and then we have some places who really need our support. The biggest problem with South Carolina education right now is the inequity in funding and the inequity in access to materials and support that some of our counties that have a higher economic support system give, such as Charleston County. And then some of those classrooms along the I-95 corridor, what was the corridor of shame video, they're still not getting the support they need. So that's really where the heart of the problem lies. And if we're going to talk about education reform in South Carolina, we have to talk about economic inequality.
When you look at as many people say, the corridor of shame, where are you emotionally from an educational standpoint?
That's one of the things that gets me up every morning. Before my current position, I worked in Burns Elementary, which at the time was one of the most at-risk schools in the state. And making sure every child, regardless of where they live or what zip code they call home, making sure each child has a quality educational experience, that's what gets me up in the morning. That's what drives my work. That's what sent me back to school 10 years ago, or I guess 13 years ago, for my doctorate, is how can we make sure that we are teaching in a way that gives access to quality instruction, that supports teachers who are willing to work with some of our most at-risk or high-need students. Right now, the research on what we call trauma-informed schools, where they're looking at how to teach the whole child, looking at emotional support, mental health, sometimes even health care in the school, in addition to math and ELA.
Right.
Those are the things that we need to have serious conversations about, and that is where I'm invested in children.
The at-risk schools, what are they right now in South Carolina?
Right now, they tend to be our schools which are low income, be they rural or more urban. They tend to be schools that, because of the way we use test data, are labeled as failing. But when I've been in these schools, I certainly don't see schools that are failing. I see teachers who are committed to children, who are doing amazing things in their classroom, who are caring for children in ways that I don't think many people realize that teachers sometimes have to care for a child. And so we label those schools at risk, or we label them failing, without really looking at the bigger picture beyond the test data.
What is that big picture?
The big picture is, in the class or in the school, does the child feel safe? Does the child feel cared for? And then only when the child feels safe and cared for can that child learn. And I think that's the biggest difference between the schools that we tout as successful and the schools that we label as at risk, is so many times those children coming into those at-risk schools don't have the safety and security that some of our other children do.
You talk about safety and security. Let me take you to another discussion that's going on right now. School resource officers,
Yes.
metal detectors.
Yes.
Where are you with this discussion?
So I've worked in schools with school resource officers, and I've seen that they can be an incredible asset to schools, especially when children live in neighborhoods where crime is an issue. They get to see law enforcement in a positive light. They get to form a bond with a police officer and feel that safety and security. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. I think when we start to criminalize a child's behavior, then that's a different discussion. When we bring law enforcement into what should be a school-based behavior problem, I don't think I think we're going beyond what a school resource officer was intended to do. Disrespect in a classroom is not a criminal offense. And when it's treated as such, that's when we see a disconnect between the role of the school resource officer and I think what the intent of the school resource officer was. And I think metal detectors on schools is just absolutely heartbreaking. I think that, and especially in light of this morning's massacre at a synagogue in Pittsburgh,
Right.
We have a bigger issue. It's not a metal detector on schools issue. We have an issue in our society with gun violence. And if we don't address that issue, it's not going to matter what we put on the school. Somebody with intent is going to find a way around it.
If you were to be elected superintendent of education,
Yes.
who will you bring to the round table as far as gun violence in this discussion?
You know, that's a great question, and it's one that I've given a lot of thought to. And I think one of the things that I've learned as a teacher, sometimes it's better to have a good question. I don't have all of the answers. I wish I did. It would make life much easier if one person had all of the answers. But I think we need to get on board with people asking the question, where do we find agreement? Where do we find agreement with people who disagree with a limit on gun rights, or are concerned that if we have any sort of limitation that it puts the Second Amendment at risk? when we look at data, 90% of the people agree with things like background checks for purchasing a weapon, and that's such an easy place to begin having a conversation. And I think bringing the people to the table, state representatives, state senators, governor, and then even local county people, and bring them on board to what needs to happen in your county, what needs to happen in your county. It's not the same. South Carolina is a diverse state, and find where that common ground is, and then make it happen at the state level.
You talk about counties, I gotta take you to Charleston County.
Yes.
Obviously, you heard about the alleged case with Marvin Gaye
I have.
at the Charleston County School District. If you were state superintendent of education right now, what would you do right now?
I think, again, it comes back to asking that good question. My information on it has been what's in the media or on social media. And so and from what I've read on that, any person who puts a child at risk should not be around children. So as superintendent, I would have to better understand, number one, what role I might have in working with the county on some sort of a resolution on that.
Okay.
Before I could make any sort of statement on what I would do. I do think that if things are what they appear to be, and the adults knew what was happening, knew that what was on his computer, and then allow him to have access to children, those adults should be held responsible. Because again, that comes back to our job is to protect children and make them feel safe and secure at schools.
And then we get back to the election. Obviously, you and Molly Spearman will be on the ballot on November 6th, but also the amendment. And it reads this from the state newspaper. On November 6th, however, voters will have a chance to change that by approving a constitutional amendment to end the election of the superintendent and make the state schools chief an appointed member of the governor's cabinet. Do you agree?
I do not agree. I think that anytime we limit the rights of voters, that we need to give ourselves pause with that. I think that, you know, the National Secretary of Education is an appointed position, and I have yet to find an educator who supports Betsy DeVos, who's currently in that position. So an appointed Secretary of Education or state superintendent does not necessarily make a qualified state superintendent. So I do not support Amendment 1.
What will you do if elected that Molly Spearman can't do right now?
Molly Spearman, I think, has been a strong advocate for teachers. Where I think the conversation gets lost is in instruction and meeting the needs of the children. And I think that is where, because I'm in the classroom right now, I'm much more present, I'm much more on the ground, if you will. I can bring that point of view and that sense of urgency into the state superintendent's office.
And between, it's just 2 weeks before this election.
It's very quick.
Why now?
You know, I asked myself that. No, I'm kidding. When Israel Romero withdrew his name, I was prompted by a friend who was like, do you want to do a write-in campaign? And I had to sit and think for a minute. And after the 2016 election, I started going to local Democratic Party meetings. And one of the constant refrains was no uncontested seats, no uncontested elections moving forward. And what we found ourselves with was an uncontested election for state superintendent of all things. And I'm a social studies teacher. I'm a huge civic nerd. I say that with pride. And I genuinely felt like it was my civic responsibility, my civic duty to step up, to give a choice. Democracy only works if there's a choice. If we weren't going to have if we were to not want to have an uncontested election, that was a messy sentence. But if we wanted there to be a choice, if we wanted there to be a true vote, somebody needed to step in. I believe my education experience qualifies me, and here I am.
I asked you about the discussions about the schools that are, in the rural schools areas of South Carolina that are really in need of help. Where are you with the discussion about charter schools?
Interesting question. I work at a charter school. I'm a sixth grade teacher at a charter school. My children attend a charter school. It was our neighborhood school until we moved 3.5 weeks ago. And I will say it was a luxury to be able to move in Charleston County and keep my children at the same school.
Okay.
With that said, I have a lot of questions about charter schools. I think that the intent is to give choice, but it doesn't give choice to our most at-risk children, because our most at-risk children tend to not have the mobility, the ability to get to a school that's 5 miles away, 3 miles away. They don't have the ability to navigate the application process. Sometimes they lack the technology to do it. I think that when we get into discussions, and we're not here in South Carolina yet. South Carolina, all charter schools are public schools. But when we get into the privatization of schools, then we're using public funds for things that we can't control. And we tend to see a lack of quality education coming out of those areas. If charter schools 100% across the board worked, I would sit here and tell you, yes, I am for charter schools. But the data is pretty inconclusive. The ones that work, work. The ones that don't fail miserably. And often there's very little oversight. So Charleston County's chosen to move in that direction. Sometimes I wonder if that was the right direction to move in.
And as we sit here right now, how would you work with current Governor of South Carolina, Gov McMaster?
That is a great question. Governor McMaster and I tend to differ a great deal. And so that would be, again, where we'd have to sit down and find our common ground.
Okay.
We would have to sit down and figure out maybe our top 3 priorities and how across the political spectrum we could work to get those things done. It was distressing for me over the last year, and then again in the debate, to hear where children who are in foster care or waiting for adoption are in state agencies that don't allow them to be adopted to people of other faiths. That is distressing to me because, again, my number 1 priority is the safety and well-being of children. And we would have to come to an agreement that we needed to rethink that policy, I think, before we could move forward.
Dr. Michele Phillips, thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome anytime. Thank you.